Alone in a sterile hospital room, I sat holding my husband's hand during his final hours. Our children, Mark and Sandra, never showed up. Not one call, not one text. It was the doctor who brought me a final letter from my husband, a letter that confirmed they'd abandoned him too. I calmly placed the letter in my purse. Months later, as I sat at the lawyer's office to discuss the will, the lawyer said, "I don't understand. This document shows they are completely disinherited and all their previous loans, gifts, and donations have been deducted from their inheritance. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I was alone in the hospital with my husband during the final stretch of his life. Other rooms down the corridor were alive with family chatter and the sound of loved ones shuffling in and out. Our room was the opposite. Silent, still, hollow. Nobody came, nobody called. When the doctor finally confirmed that my husband was gone, he placed a folded farewell letter into my trembling hands. "Open the safe," it read. "Everything will make sense. I'm glad you were here." The constant mechanical beeping of the heart monitor had begun to feel like my own pulse. Steady, inescapable. For 7 long days, I barely left that cold, stiff vinyl chair pulled up next to Carlton's hospital bed. I sat there watching his chest lift and fall. In perfect rhythm, each breath forced by machines, room 314 had become my whole world, and I had never known a place could feel so isolated. Across the hall in room 312, it was the complete opposite, a revolving door of visitors all week. I could hear the mix of children's laughter, soft conversations between adults, the faint shuffle of flower vases being moved around, and the scrape of chairs making space for more bodies. Yesterday alone, I counted 12 people crammed in there, celebrating because their family patriarch had finally opened his eyes after a week. Meanwhile, in our room, the only sound was the low hum and rhythmic blips of the machines keeping my husband alive. My name is Everly. I'm 69. Carlton is 71. Though now, lying before me, he looked decades older. His once strong, capable hands had turned almost translucent, skin paper-thin, veins raised, fingers frail. We've been married 47 years. Through all those decades, I never once imagined that when his time came, I would be facing it alone. "Mrs. Patterson," DeRoss's voice came from the doorway. His face carried a gentle expression, but behind it was something heavier. Something I had come to recognize in people delivering bad news. He was younger than my son Mark, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes that had clearly seen too many endings. "How are you holding up?" he asked. I tried to lift the corners of my mouth into something resembling a smile, but it landed somewhere closer to a grimace. "I'm fine, doctor. Has there been any change?" He stepped inside, shutting the door quietly behind him. "I'm afraid not. His vitals are stable, but..." He paused as if weighing out his next words. "Have you been able to reach your family?" The question landed like a physical blow, even though I had been bracing for it. He'd asked me the same thing 3 days ago, and the day before that. Each time I gave him the same answer. They're coming," I whispered. "They live far away." He nodded, but I could see he didn't quite believe me. DeRoss had been Carlton's main physician for 2 weeks now, ever since the stroke sent us rushing to the emergency room. He had seen the empty visitor log taped outside our door. He had noticed the lack of flowers, the absence of get well cards lined along the window ledge. "Mrs. Patterson," he'd said gently, "is there anyone I can call for you, a friend perhaps? You shouldn't be going through this by yourself." The tenderness in his voice nearly cracked me open. Nearly, but after a lifetime of swallowing my pain, I had learned how to hold myself together. Even now, especially now. "Thank you, DeRoss, but I'm managing just fine." He lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to say something else before giving a small nod. "I'll be back in a few hours to check on him. Please call the nurses if you need anything at all." When the door clicked shut, I sank deeper into that awful chair and turned my gaze to Carlton's face. Even now, unconscious, dying, he wore an expression like he was still waiting for someone. The truth was, I had tried to reach our children. Mark lives in Seattle with his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenage kids. He's some kind of high-level executive at a tech company, the kind of achievement Carlton and I once dreamed our son might reach. Sandra lives in Phoenix with her husband Derek and their 3 children. She manages a luxury boutique and lives in a perfectly manicured, gated neighborhood. I had called Mark first, the morning after Carlton's stroke. "Hello," he answered, voice clipped and distracted. "Mark, it's Mom. Your father's in the hospital. He's had a stroke." A pause. "How bad is it?" "Bad. The doctors aren't sure if he'll wake up. I think you should come." Another pause. Longer this time. "Mom, I'm in the middle of a huge project at work. Can you keep me updated? If things get really serious, call me back." If things get really serious. As if this, his father lying between life and death, wasn't serious enough. Sandra's reply had been even colder. "Mom, I can't just drop everything. Do you know how much a last-minute flight costs? Besides, Dad's tough. He'll pull through this." That was 5 days ago. Neither had called since. I looked around the sterile white room, the blank walls, the one narrow window facing the parking lot, the empty chair beside me that should have been filled by one of our children. From room 312, I could hear someone singing "Happy Birthday," terribly off-key. Everyone was laughing, and I sat here wondering, how did we get to this point? How had Carlton and I, who had poured everything we had into raising Mark and Sandra, ended up completely alone? I reached across the bed and wrapped my fingers around Carlton's hand, careful not to tug at the IV line. His skin was cold now, but beneath it, I could still feel the calluses, the rough proof of 40 years spent building, fixing, working. These hands had built our first home. They had guided Mark's fingers around a baseball bat. They had patiently braided Sandra's hair before school. "I'm here, sweetheart," I whispered. The quiet hum of machines filled the room, their steady beeping the only constant witness to the hours we spent here. I leaned close and whispered, "I'm right here." Outside our door, the world continued without us. Families embraced after long absences. Laughter bubbled from the halls as patients celebrated small victories. Children clutching colorful handmade cards raced to the bedsides of their grandparents. But here in room 314, it was only me and Carlton, bound together in this moment, facing the uncertainty ahead just as we always had. Side by side, yet completely alone. As evening deepened and visiting hours slipped away, I braced myself for another night in that same hardback chair. The nurses had kindly offered me a cot, but I couldn't accept. What if Carlton opened his eyes and I wasn't there? What if he needed me? What if these were the final hours we would ever share, and I let them pass while I slept? So I stayed awake, my fingers wrapped gently around his, my eyes fixed on the rise and fall of his chest, refusing to let the quiet consume me. I tried not to look at the empty chairs that seemed to multiply around us. And as I sat there in the stillness, my mind wandered, back to the day everything began to change. 11 years ago, Carlton had just turned 60. He'd been with Brennan and Associates for 23 years, starting as a young laborer and climbing the ladder until he was a respected site supervisor. That job was his pride, and every home and building he helped create stood as proof of his dedication. But then the economy collapsed, and the life we knew crumbled with it. I remember the morning he came home hours earlier than usual, his face pale and slack, as though the life had been drained from him. He had been laid off, along with half the crew. At 60 years old, with a back worn from decades of heavy lifting and hands permanently marked by hard labor, Carlton suddenly found himself competing for work against men half his age. "It's temporary," he kept telling me in those first weeks, clinging to hope like a lifeline. "Construction always bounces back." But the weeks became months, and the phone calls never came. I watched his confidence erode, slow and painful, like mortar dissolving in relentless rain. Every morning he dressed neatly, clutching a stack of resumes, and left determined to make something happen. Every evening he returned a little quieter, a little heavier in spirit. That's when Mark began to drift away. Our son had always been ambitious, his eyes fixed on achievements Carlton and I had never chased. He'd earned his business degree, secured a solid job in Seattle, and married Jennifer, whose family had money. When Carlton lost his job, I think Mark saw it as more than bad luck. He saw it as a personal failure that reflected on him. I'll never forget that Thanksgiving. Mark and Hader drove down with the Bears, and Carlton was practically glowing at the thought of seeing them. He had been unemployed for 8 months, but he was still trying to stand tall. to hold on to hope. "So, Dad," Mark asked at the dinner table, his tone light but edged with something sharp, "any luck with the job search?" Carlton straightened in his chair. "I've got a few leads. Interview next week with a landscaping company." "Landscaping?" Mark's voice carried just enough disdain to make the air tighten. "Work is work, son," Carlton replied quietly. Mark shook his head. "I don't understand how you let this happen. Didn't you see the signs? Didn't you plan for this?" The table went silent. Even the kids stopped eating. Carlton's cheeks flushed, not with anger, but with a shame that seemed to weigh down his whole body. "Mark," I began, but Carlton touched my arm, stopping at me. "Your father worked hard for 23 years, I said firmly. "He didn't choose to get laid off." That was when Jennifer, usually content to stay silent during family matters, decided to speak. "Maybe this is an opportunity for a fresh start. There are plenty of jobs for people Carlton's age. Walmart always needs greeters." The words landed like poison. Carlton excused himself quietly from the table, and when I went looking for him, I found him in the garage, sitting on his workbench, his head in his hands. After that Thanksgiving, Mark's visits grew rare. His calls became short, empty exchanges. When Carlton finally found work 6 months later, maintenance for the school district, at half his old pay, Mark barely acknowledged it. But Carlton was grateful just to be working again. Sandra's reaction had been different, but just as painful. Where Mark pulled away out of embarrassment, Sandra did so from disappointment. She had grown used to a certain lifestyle after marrying Derek, who made good money in real estate. She lived in a large home with a pool, drove a luxury SUV, sent her children to private schools. Somewhere along the line, she began expecting everyone around her to match that standard. "Mom, why don't you and Dad move to a smaller place?" she suggested during one of her increasingly infrequent visits. "That house is too big for just the two of you now, and clearly, Dad's not making the same money he used to." She was talking about the home Carlton had built himself when Mark was 5 and Sandra was 3. Every nail, every board, every inch of drywall carried the imprint of his love for our family. The thought of leaving it was unthinkable. "We're managing just fine," I told her. Sandra's eyes drifted over our modest living room with a look she didn't quite hide, a mixture of pity and disdain. "Are you sure about that? When's the last time you had the carpets cleaned or updated the kitchen?" Her words still sting when I think back on them. "Mom, you're living like poor people." Poor people. The phrase hung in the air like something sour, as if losing money, falling on hard times, somehow made us less than we used to be, as if dignity came with a price tag. The real breaking point came 2 years later. Sandra called one evening, her voice tight but sweet in that way she used when she wanted something. She had just given birth to her third child, and Derek's business was in trouble. Cash flow problems, she said. They were behind on the mortgage. Medical bills were piling up. They needed $5,000 to keep things afloat. Carlton didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions or suggest other options. He went straight to the bank, cashed in part of his already modest retirement fund, and sent her the money. It meant beans and rice for months at our table. It meant putting off repairs we'd already delayed too long. Sandra never paid it back. She didn't even acknowledge what that sacrifice had cost us. 6 months later, when Derek's business recovered, they took a vacation to Hawaii. There they were, smiling in matching shirts, toes in the sand, posting picture after picture on Facebook. Carlton didn't say a word, but I saw it. The way his eyes went dull for a moment when he scrolled through those photos, the shadow that settled over him like a cloud. After that, something shifted. The space between us and our children grew until it felt like an unbridgeable canyon. Mark's visits shrank to a single hurried appearance each Christmas. Even then, he'd watch the clock like he had somewhere better to be. Sandra called occasionally, but usually only when she needed something. The visits stopped altogether. Carlton began to blame himself. "I failed them," he'd say in the quiet moments, the ones when the weight of his thoughts bent his shoulders. "I was supposed to provide for my family, and I couldn't even keep a job." "You didn't fail anyone," I'd tell him. "You gave them everything you had." But deep down, I wondered if he was right. Had we raised children who valued success over loyalty? Who measured their father's worth only in terms of the size of his paycheck? Sitting in that hospital room now, watching the machines breathe for him, I realized Carlton had spent the last 11 years trying to win back something he never should have lost: their respect. He took overtime at the school district, picked up weekend jobs, worked himself to exhaustion, all so they wouldn't see him as a failure. And in the end, none of it mattered. When he needed them most, when he was fighting for his life, they weren't there. Too busy, too far away, or maybe even too ashamed. The irony was bitter. Carlton had built homes that would stand for generations. He had raised children who had reached the very heights he'd once dreamed for them. But when his own foundation crumbled, when his walls began to fall, there was no one left to help him rebuild. Except me. Always me. I squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar ridge of his wedding band, the one that had never left his finger in 47 years. "I'm still here, Carlton," I whispered. "I'll always be here." But as the machines hummed and clicked in their lonely vigil, a cold thought slipped in, that soon even I might not be enough. The end came on a Tuesday morning, quiet and unremarkable. Dawn broke over the hospital parking lot as I sat slumped in the chair beside his bed, my head resting against the rail. I must have fallen asleep holding his hand sometime around 4 a.m. It was the change in the machine's rhythm that woke me. Ross was there within minutes, along with two nurses whose faces had become familiar over the last week. They moved with gentle precision, checking monitors, adjusting lines, but I could see it in their eyes. They already knew. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Ross said softly, his hand resting on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry." I nodded. Words wouldn't come. I had known this moment was inevitable, but when it finally arrived, the weight of it still knocked the breath from me. Carlton was gone. After 47 years of marriage, I was truly, completely alone. The next hour was a blur, signing papers, answering questions in a voice that didn't feel like mine. The nurses gave me time to sit with him one last time. He looked younger somehow, as if the lines of worry had finally smoothed away. His face was peaceful, almost serene. When I began gathering my things, Dr. Ross approached, a manila envelope in his hand. "Your husband asked me to give this to you, Basan," he said quietly. "He gave it to me 3 days ago when he was still awake. He made me promise to wait until it was over." My hands trembled as I took it. It was heavier than I expected, with something small and metallic inside, along with folded papers. "He was very clear that you should read it alone," Dr. Ross added. I thanked him and walked out into a world that felt too bright, too loud for a day like this. In the parking lot, I sat in the car with the envelope clutched to my chest, gathering the courage to open it. Inside, I found a small brass key and a letter written in Carlton's careful, deliberate handwriting. "My dearest Everly," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing the hardest part alone. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for many things, but mostly I'm sorry that our children weren't there when you needed them most. I need you to go home, to our bedroom closet. Behind my old work boots, you'll find our safety deposit box. The key in this envelope will open it. I've left you something there. I've been working on this for years, but before you open that box, there's something you need to hear. Something I need you to know with absolute certainty. Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Even when everything else fell apart, when I felt like I had failed everyone who mattered, your faith in me never wavered. You never stopped standing beside me, never stopped believing in who I was, even in my darkest hours. The password to the box is the day we first met, October 15th, 1975. Do you remember? You were wearing that blue dress, and you laughed at my ridiculous joke about the weather. That moment, that laugh, I knew right then I was going to marry you. It took me 3 long months to find the courage to actually ask you out. But in my heart, the decision had already been made. I love you, Everly. I always have. And wherever I am now, whatever has become of me, I always will. Forever yours, Carlton. By the time I finished reading, my cheeks were wet with tears. They blurred the paper, but I could still see him in every single word. I could hear his voice, steady but warm, as if he were speaking them directly into my ear. I could picture him writing this in secret, knowing there was a chance he might not live long enough to say these things to me face to face. The drive home felt unreal, like I was moving through a life that no longer belonged to me. The streets were the same. The houses stood just where they always had. Even the great oak tree in our front yard, the one Carlton planted the year Mark was born, swayed in the same familiar rhythm. And yet, nothing felt the same. When I stepped inside, the house was suffocatingly quiet. 47 years of shared laughter, arguments, whispered confessions in the dark, all of it still lived in these walls. But now it was just echoes, empty echoes. My hands shook as I made myself a cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, the brass key Carlton had left for me glinting in the morning light. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to move. When I finally stood and made my way to our bedroom, I found he had been even more private than I'd ever guessed. Behind his old work boots, just where he said it would be, sat a small fireproof safe I had never seen before. The digital lock blinked, patiently waiting for the date that had changed both of our lives. 575. The mechanism clicked open. Inside, I found far more than I had anticipated. Several $1,000s in cash. My grandmother's pearl necklace, the one I thought had been lost years ago. A few other pieces of jewelry I hadn't laid eyes on since we'd hidden them away for safekeeping. But what stole my breath completely was the leather-bound journal resting on top. My name was scrawled across the cover in Carlton's unmistakable handwriting, and beneath it, in smaller letters, what they never knew. With fingers trembling as if from cold, I opened to the very first page. January 3rd, 2013. Mark's birthday. Everly baked his favorite cake. We spent the day waiting for the phone to ring. It never did. She tried to pretend it didn't matter, but later I caught her crying quietly in the kitchen. I should have stepped in. I should have been stronger for her. I turned to another page, chosen at random. June 15th, 2015. Sandra called again, asking him for her money. Said it was for the kids' school supplies. But I'd seen on Facebook just last week that Derek bought a new boat. Everly doesn't know I have that Facebook account I used to keep tabs on them. She'd be devastated if she knew how the money was really being spent. I cashed in another CD to give Sandra what she wanted. I'll tell Everly it was from a good investment maturing. On and on it went, page after page, year after year, Carlton quietly recording every slight, every forgotten holiday, every call that never came. But more than that, he wrote down every sacrifice he made to keep me from feeling the full sting of our children's absence. November 24th, 2016. Thanksgiving. Mark didn't come again. Third year in a row. Everly set a place for him anyway, just in case. After dinner, I found her scraping the untouched plate into the trash. I told her we'd had a nice, quiet holiday, just the two of us, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. Called Mark to thank him for the flowers that never came. Left a voicemail describing how beautiful they were in case Everly checked the messages. December 12th, 2017. Sandra's youngest broke his arm. I learned about it 3 days later on Facebook. We weren't called. We weren't told. I mailed a card with money to help with the hospital bills. Signed from both of us. Everly still doesn't know her grandson was hurt. The more I read, the more the truth sank in. Carlton hadn't simply been chronicling the distance between us and our children. He had been actively shielding me from it. Those birthday cards, those bouquets of flowers. The occasional bottle of wine or thoughtful gift I'd assumed had come from our kids. Every one of them had been from him. He'd been quietly spending money we didn't really have, building an illusion so I wouldn't have to face the truth. March 8th, 2010. Mother's Day is coming. Everly's been cleaning the house all week, hoping someone might stop by. I can't bear to watch her heart break again. Ordered flowers, signed a card from Sandra and the kids, bought a bottle of wine and told her it was from Mark. Sometimes I think that lying to protect her is the most honest thing I can do. I had to close the journal. The sheer weight of his love, of all the years he'd spent quietly carrying my pain, was more than I could bear in that moment. All these years, I had believed our children had maintained at least some small thread of connection with us. I had treasured those rare flowers, those occasional gifts, those little surprises. But it had been Carlton, all along. The illusion that our children still cared. Carlton had been the one to preserve it for me, shielding me from the truth with quiet determination. He had taken that wound into his own heart, shouldering the sting of their absence so I would never have to feel its full weight. I closed the journal and sat heavily on our bed, surrounded by the silent witnesses of a love so deep, so unselfish, that it stole my breath. Carlton hadn't merely been my husband. He had been my guardian, my shield against a world that could be cold, my buffer against a cruelty he had never wanted me to truly face. And he had done it without complaint, carrying the heavy burden of our children's indifference so I could still cling to the fragile hope that somewhere deep down, they hadn't completely erased us from their lives. The house felt different now, as though his presence still lingered, charged with the echo of a love story I was only beginning to grasp in its entirety. Carlton was gone, but he had left behind something far more valuable than money or jewelry. He had left me the truth about who he truly was and what he had silently endured for the sake of our family. I spent the rest of that day hunched over his journal. Each page I turned fractured my heart a little more, but what I felt wasn't only heartbreak. It was awe. The man I had lived beside for 47 years had been carrying secrets, secrets that revealed a depth of devotion I had never fully understood. April 15th, 2018. Mark's company is in trouble. I saw it mentioned in the business section of the Seattle paper online. Possible layoffs ahead. I know him. He's too proud to ask for help and too ashamed to admit he might need his old man. Sent an anonymous money order for $5,000 to his home address. Told him it was from a satisfied client who wanted to invest in his future. Everly thinks I used that money to fix the roof, but the roof can wait another year. I stared at that entry for a long time. I remembered that spring, remembered Carlton insisting we postpone fixing the glaring leak in our bedroom ceiling. He had said money was tight after some unexpected expenses, and I had assumed he meant the water heater that had broken in March. Now I realized he had probably fixed that heater himself, quietly, so he could save enough to help our ungrateful son. I turned more pages, my eyes moving quickly, my pulse slow and heavy. Every entry seemed to peel back another layer of sacrifice. September 3rd, 2018. Sandra's oldest starts high school at that fancy private academy. Tuition is $15,000 a year. Derek's business is struggling again. I can see the strain in Sandra's Facebook posts, even though she tries to hide it behind photos of coffee mugs and inspirational quotes. Took out a loan against my life insurance policy, sent the money anonymously as a scholarship from a local benefactor. Sandra posted about their good fortune, but never once wondered if her parents might have had anything to do with it. My hands trembled as I read. A loan against his life insurance policy. That was money meant to provide for me after he was gone. He had sacrificed it for a granddaughter who didn't even know our names, just so she could have an education in a place he thought she deserved to be. October 31st, 2018. Halloween. Everly bought candy, hoping some of the neighborhood kids might stop by. We got 3 trick-or-treaters the whole night. She tried to act like it didn't matter, but I caught her looking, again and again, at the pictures Sandra posted of her kids in their costumes. Beautiful kids, our grandchildren. I wonder if they even know they have grandparents who would give anything just to see them once. I remember that Halloween vividly. I had bought far too much candy, telling myself it was for the neighborhood kids. But in truth, I had been hoping Sandra might surprise us and bring her children over, even for a moment. Carlton had sat beside me on the porch for hours, the two of us pretending to enjoy the crisp October air, both of us silently wishing for the sound of little feet running up our steps. December 20th, 2019. Mark's son got accepted into Stanford. Saw Jennifer post about it on Facebook. The boy doesn't even know we exist, but I'm proud of him anyway. College costs a fortune these days. Started selling my old tools piece by piece. Told Everly I was just clearing out the garage, but really, I'm building another college fund. Anonymous, of course. Someday I hope that boy knows his grandfather believed in him, even if I never get the chance to tell him myself. I had to put the journal down and walk away for a moment. Carlton's tools, those had been his treasures. He had collected them over decades, each one carefully chosen, each one carrying its own story. I could picture him with them, working on a project, the satisfaction in his eyes when a job was done well. Over the years, I had noticed them disappearing, one by one. He had always had a reason. He'd lent one to a neighbor, donated another to a young man starting in construction, sold a few because he didn't need them anymore. Now I knew the truth. He had been dismantling his own life piece by piece to give something to grandchildren who didn't even know his face. I made myself a cup of tea and returned to the journal, though it felt like opening it was the same as cutting into my own heart. March 15th, 2020. Pandemic started. Everyone's scared. Everyone's isolated. Called Mark to check if his family was okay. He answered like I was a telemarketer trying to sell him something. "We're fine, Dad. I can't talk right now." 30-second conversation. "I worry about..." The sentence trailed off there, leaving only a smudge of ink where his pen must have paused. They've never really worried about us, but that's never stopped me from worrying about them. Everly has no idea how many times I call the kids. She'd be hurt if she knew how often they don't answer. May 10th, 2020, Mother's Day. Everly tried her best to act like it didn't bother her that neither of the kids called. She spent the afternoon in the garden, planting and trimming, humming softly to herself. I know that humming. It's what she does when she's trying to keep the tears from falling. I ordered her a beautiful bouquet and tucked in a card that read, "Thanks for being the best mom in the world. Love, Sandra." When the delivery arrived, the look on her face was worth every single penny. July 4th, 2020, Independence Day. Everly cooked a big dinner, holding on to a quiet hope that one of the kids might surprise us with a visit. Mark lives 2,000 miles away, but Sandra is only a 4-hour drive. Still, neither of them came. We ate potato salad at the kitchen table and watched the fireworks on TV. I told her it was nice to have a quiet holiday, just the two of us. She nodded and smiled, but I caught her staring at Sandra's Facebook photos. A backyard barbecue with friends and neighbors, all through the afternoon. The years went on like this. The journal entries told the story of a man who loved so deeply that he carried the weight of disappointment alone, hiding it from the woman he adored. Carlton, me, had been building an entire fiction, carefully shielding Everly from the full truth of our children's indifference. I had paid for that protection with my health, my savings, and pieces of my soul. January 8th, 2021, Everly's birthday. Once again, the kids didn't call. I bought her a delicate necklace and said it was from Mark, then a silk scarf, claiming Sandra had picked it out just for her. She was so happy, talking over and over about how thoughtful they were to remember her taste in colors and fabrics. She did not know I'd been buying her gifts from them for 3 years now. August 12th, 2021. I saw on Facebook that Sandra's middle child had broken his leg at soccer camp. They posted photos from the emergency room, but we weren't called. We weren't even told. I sent him a care package filled with books, games, and snacks, signing the note, "From your grandparents who love you." I still wonder if Sandra told him it was from us, or if she just let him think some stranger had cared enough to send it. November 25th, 2021, Thanksgiving. Everly cooked for 6 people, even though it was just the 2 of us. She always does that on every holiday, just in case the kids show up unannounced. They never do. We ate at a table groaning with food, and I knew we'd be eating leftovers for a week. But I never told her to cook less. Sometimes hope is all you have left. That day I cried again. But it wasn't just grief this time. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the overwhelming realization that I had been loved more deeply and more completely than I'd ever truly understood. Carlton hadn't just been my husband. He'd been my shield, keeping the harsh edges of our children's absence from cutting too deeply into my heart. And yet, as I kept reading, I saw another truth emerge. Carlton wasn't only protecting me, he was keeping careful, meticulous records. Every anonymous gift, every silent loan, every unreturned phone call, all documented with dates, amounts, and details. December 25th, 2021, Christmas. We sent gifts to all the grandchildren, spending $800 we didn't really have. Everly was so excited picking them out, imagining the kids' smiles when they opened them. But there was no response. No calls, no pictures, not even a text to say thank you. I'm beginning to think they just toss our packages away without even opening them. March 18th, 2022. Mark lost his job. I saw the update on LinkedIn and seeking new opportunities. I sent him another anonymous money order, $3,000 this time. I had to borrow against the house to do it, but I couldn't stand the thought of him struggling if I could help. I told Everly the bank had called about refinancing at better rates. She trusted me to handle all the paperwork. The last entries were the hardest to read. October 15th, 2022, our 46th wedding anniversary. The kids didn't call to congratulate us. They never do. But Everly and I danced in the kitchen to that old song from our wedding day. She's still beautiful. Still the girl in the blue dress who laughed at all my terrible jokes. I'm the luckiest man alive, even if our children never understood that. December 31st, 2022, New Year's Eve. Everly fell asleep on the couch before midnight. I covered her with her favorite blanket and just sat there watching her breathe. She looked peaceful, the way she used to when the kids were small, and the house rang with laughter. I miss those days, but I don't regret a single sacrifice. Love isn't about keeping score. It's about giving everything you have and being grateful for the chance to give it. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before my stroke, January 15th, 2023. Everly doesn't know about the chest pains I've been having. I don't want her to worry. Updated the safety deposit box today, made sure everything is in order for her. If something happens to me, I hope she'll understand that every decision I made was rooted in love. I hope she'll know she was enough, more than enough. She was everything. When I closed the journal, I pressed it against my chest. It felt heavy, not just with paper and ink, but with 47 years of love distilled into these pages. Carlton had emptied our savings account, taken out a loan against our home, and even sold the tools he treasured more than anything, tools he'd collected over a lifetime. He did it all for children who couldn't even be bothered to pick up the phone on holidays. And yet, alongside all those sacrifices, he gave me something far more valuable than money. He gave me the comfort of believing all these years that our children still had hearts, that somewhere beneath the noise of their busy schedules and their misplaced priorities, they still remembered to love us. The truth, when it finally came, was both shattering and strangely beautiful. Our children had abandoned us completely, but Carlton had loved me enough to carry that cruel knowledge by himself, shielding me from it until the very end. Carlton's funeral took place on a bleak, overcast Thursday morning at St. Mary's, the very same church where, 47 years earlier, we had stood hand in hand and promised each other forever. I made every arrangement myself, the service, the flowers, even the modest little reception afterward. Father McKenna, who had known Carlton for 3 decades, spoke with a quiet reverence in his eulogy, describing a man whose faith was lived out not in grand gestures, but in everyday acts of service and love that asked for nothing in return. 19 people came. Most were neighbors, and a few were old co-workers from the school district. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought a tray of homemade cookies. The Kowalskis from down the street helped set the flower arrangements in place. These were the people who had become our true family when our own flesh and blood had drifted away. Mark and Sandra arrived 15 minutes before the service began. They walked in together dressed in expensive black outfits that, I suspected, cost more than Carlton's burial suit. Mark looked polished, successful. His hair meticulously styled, his shoes shined to a mirror finish. Sandra wore a designer dress and carried a luxury handbag I recognized from one of her Facebook posts, a Christmas gift from Derek, priced at $800. They sat beside me in the front pew, yet the space between us felt like a wide and empty ocean. They'd said a few stiff, obligatory words of condolence when they first came in, but nothing more. During the service, I watched them from the corner of my eye. Twice, Mark glanced down at his phone. Sandra dabbed her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief that probably cost more than my wedding dress, but I noticed the absence of actual tears. It felt like a performance, grief worn like an accessory for the benefit of the people around us. After the burial, we returned to the church hall for the reception. Guests shared stories of Carlton's kindness, his patience, his quiet dignity, how he was always willing to help anyone without expecting a thing in return. I listened to one memory after another, my heart swelling with love and aching with loss. Mark and Sandra didn't join in. They stood off to the side, whispering to each other. I caught fragments of their conversation. Something about the house, probate, getting this settled quickly. Mrs. Henderson approached me, pressing a small paper plate into my hands. "Your husband was a good man, Everly," she said gently. "He helped my Tom fix our roof last spring. Wouldn't take a dime for it, said neighbors help neighbors. I nodded, remembering Carlton coming home that day with scraped knuckles and that small, satisfied smile of his. He'd never mentioned that Tom was struggling financially after his heart attack, or that the roof repair had been urgent because of storm damage. He just did what needed to be done, because that's who he was. When most of the guests had left and the folding chairs stood stacked in the corner, Mark and Sandra finally approached me. The three of us were alone in the quiet hall, surrounded by the fading scent of coffee and flowers. Mom, Mark began, his tone clipped and businesslike. We need to talk about Dad's affairs. The house, the estate, all of that. I looked at him, this man who had Carlton's eyes but none of his warmth. What about them? I asked. Sandra stepped forward, her voice coated with the kind of customer service sympathy she probably used in her boutique. We know this is a difficult time, but there are practical matters to consider. The house is too big for you now, and the upkeep is going to be expensive. Mark picked up where she left off. We've been thinking it might be best to sell it. You could move into a nice senior community, somewhere with people your own age. We could help you find something appropriate. Appropriate. As if my home of 40 years, the one Carlton and I had filled with laughter, arguments, Christmas mornings, and late-night talks, was suddenly unsuitable for me just because he was gone. Sandra added, her voice turning brisk. We could handle all the arrangements, list the house, divide the proceeds fairly. It would be so much easier for everyone. I stared at them, these two people I had carried, raised, loved without condition for their entire lives. Their father had been in the ground for less than 3 hours, and already they were circling the estate like business partners closing a deal. Have either of you asked how I'm doing? I said quietly. They looked at each other, puzzled. I mean emotionally, I clarified. Have you asked how I'm coping with losing the love of my life? Have you wondered if I'm scared or lonely or heartbroken? Mark shifted uncomfortably. Of course we care about that, Mom. That's why we think you should be somewhere with more support, Mark said. What kind of support? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Professional support, Sandra answered, her tone carrying the kind of false gentleness that feels more like a dismissal. People trained to help seniors cope with loss. Seniors. As if the moment Carlton took his last breath, I'd instantly turned into some fragile, incompetent version of myself. I see, I said slowly. And where exactly have you been for the past 11 years? Where was all this support when your father lost his job? Where were you when he had to cash in his retirement savings to bail you out of your emergencies? Where were you when he sold the tools he loved just to send money to grandchildren who wouldn't even recognize him if they passed him on the street? The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to press down on the room. Mark's face went pale. Sandra's carefully applied makeup didn't hide the flicker of guilt that flashed across her expression. What are you talking about? He asked, but there was no conviction in his voice. He already knew. I reached into my purse and pulled out Carlton's journal, the worn leather cover soft from years of being handled. I placed it on the table between us. Your father kept a record, I said. Every anonymous gift you ever received. Every loan you didn't realize you were given. Every sacrifice he made while you went on pretending he didn't exist. Sandra's eyes fixed on the journal, unblinking. I never understood that money order for $5,000 that saved your company, I continued, looking at Mark. That was your father. He took out a loan against our house to help you. Mark's jaw dropped. That was from a client. No, I said firmly. It was from a man who loved you enough to bankrupt himself to keep your career alive, even though you hadn't spoken to him in months. I turned to Sandra. Your daughter's private school tuition. Your son's hospital bills when he broke his leg. Those anonymous scholarships and unexpected windfalls you bragged about on Facebook. Every single one came from your father. He even cashed in his life insurance to pay for your children's education, all while we couldn't afford to fix the roof that leaked every time it rained. Sandra's hand flew to her throat. We never asked him to. No, I said quietly. You never asked. You never called. You never visited. You simply vanished from our lives and left your father to love you from a distance. watching through social media as he worked himself to the bone for your happiness. The color drained from both their faces. Mark ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so much like Carlton's it made my chest ache. Mom, we didn't know, Mark said weakly. Of course you didn't, I replied, because knowing would have required you to care enough to ask. It would have meant staying connected, being part of our lives, remembering that your parents existed. I opened the journal to a random page and read aloud. Mark's birthday. Everly baked his favorite cake. We waited by the phone all day, but he never called. She tried to hide how much it hurt, but I saw her crying in the kitchen later. Sandra's perfect composure began to crack. We were busy, Mom. We had our own families to take care of. Too busy for a phone call? Too busy to acknowledge the gifts we sent your children? Too busy to visit when your father was dying in the hospital? Mark shook his head. We didn't know he was that sick. I called you both, I said, my voice trembling now. I told you he'd had a stroke. I told you he might not wake up. You said you'd call back if things got really serious. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned too long. Your father spent the last 11 years trying to prove he was still worthy of your love, I went on. He gave you everything he had and more than he could afford. He shielded me from knowing just how completely you had abandoned us. He died still holding on to the hope that someday you'd remember he existed. I closed the journal and looked at the two people who used to be the center of my world, but now felt like strangers wearing familiar faces. And now you want to sell his house, I said, the house he built with his own hands, the house he worked 3 jobs to keep while raising you. You want to put me in some facility and split the proceeds fairly. Neither of them could look at me. Tell me, I said, my voice rising with every word, what exactly would be fair about that? Fair would have been visiting your father while he was alive. Fair would have been calling him on his birthday or Christmas, or just to say hello. Fair would have been acknowledging the grandfather who loved your children so much he sacrificed everything for them. Mark swallowed hard before speaking, his voice barely a whisper. We made mistakes, Mom. We can do better now. I stared at him, this middle-aged man who still believed he could talk his way out of consequences. No, Mark, you can't do better now. Your father is dead. Your chance to do better died with him, in a hospital room you couldn't be bothered to walk into. Sandra began to cry, real tears this time, not the dry-eyed performance she gave at the funeral. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sure you are, I said evenly. But sorry doesn't give your father back the respect he deserved. Sorry doesn't return the money he spent on your ungrateful children. Sorry. The empty chair in the hospital room where you should have been still sat there, untouched, and no amount of words could fill it. I slipped Carlton's worn leather journal back into my purse, its weight of familiar comfort, and reached for my coat. The house isn't for sale, I said quietly but firmly, and neither am I. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the exit of the church hall, leaving my children behind in a stunned, breathless silence. As the doors swung shut behind me, I felt something I hadn't tasted in years, the sharp, clean satisfaction of speaking the whole truth without softening it for anyone. 6 months after Carlton's funeral, I stood in the departure lounge at LAX with a boarding pass in my hand and my heart pounding with an excitement I hadn't known in decades. My destination? Ireland, more specifically County Cork, the birthplace of Carlton's great-grandfather before he left for America in 1923. This trip had been one of Carlton's lifelong dreams. For years, he'd pored over genealogy records, tracing his family line to a tiny village called Balvery. He'd shown me photographs of moss-covered stone churches and endless rolling green hills, speaking about how one day we'd walk those same winding paths his ancestors had once traveled. But someday never arrived. There was always another urgent thing. A bill to pay, a leak in the roof to fix, money to send in secret to children who rarely said thank you. And now it was only Beaton and the dream Carlton never got to fulfill, and the money he'd quietly tucked away in that safety deposit box, waiting for the right time. After I confronted Mark and Sandra at the funeral, I heard from them exactly twice. The first was a phone call from Mark, full of apology, suggesting we work together as a family to heal. I hung up on him before he finished his sentence. The second was a letter from Sandra's lawyer, questioning the validity of Carlton's financial records and hinting that there might be legal complications with the money he had given away. I'd sent that letter straight to my attorney with a short note. Please inform Mrs. Derek Hastings that all of her father's gifts were legal, fully documented, and given of his own free will. Any attempt to recover those funds will result in the full disclosure of the circumstances under which they were given. I never heard from Sandra's lawyer again. The flight to Dublin was the first time I'd left the country, the first time I'd been on a plane in over 20 years. Carlton and I had talked about traveling once he retired, but retirement was another one of those some days that vanished before we could reach it. As the plane lifted into the sky, I pressed my face to the window, watching California shrink beneath a blanket of clouds. We're finally doing it, Carlton, I whispered. We're going to Ireland. I had booked a 2-week tour that would take me through Dublin, Cork, and the Western counties. But before joining the group, I had one place I needed to visit first. 3 days later, I found myself in the village of Ballyvorney, population 847, standing before a weathered gravestone in the church cemetery. The inscription was barely visible. Patrick Patterson, 1834 to 1889. Beloved father and grandfather. Carlton's great-great-grandfather. In my hand was a small cloth bag of earth from our garden in California, soil from the land Carlton had fought so hard to keep. I sprinkled it gently over Patrick's grave and bowed my head in prayer for both men, the ancestor who had the courage to begin a new life in a strange country, and the descendant who had honored that courage by building something enduring with his own hands. The church rector, Father O'Sullivan, a warm, silver-haired man in his 70s, had been delighted to help me piece together Carlton's family history. Over tea and biscuits in the rectory, he brought out parish records, stretching back nearly 200 years. Your husband's people were farmers, he said, tapping a finger against a faded ledger. Good people, from what the records show. They stayed in the area until the famine years. That's when young Patrick decided to try his luck in America. Carlton would have loved to know that, I told him. He always wondered about his roots. Father O'Sullivan smiled knowingly. But he knew the important parts. I think the values that matter don't change much from generation to generation. Hard work, loyalty to family, and faith in something greater than yourself. Family loyalty. The words clung to me as I continued my travels through Ireland. Everywhere I went, I saw it alive and unshakable. Families gathering in pubs, 3 generations living close enough to share daily life, adult children caring tenderly for their aging parents. It made me think about how different things might have been if Mark and Sandra had inherited more than just their father's eyes. In Galway, I met Bridget, an elderly widow who ran a small, cozy bed and breakfast. She was about my age and had lost her husband only 2 years earlier. Over breakfast one morning, she asked about my family. I have 2 children, I said after a pause, but they're very busy with their own lives. Bridget gave a knowing nod. Mine too, love, but they come around when they can. Family is everything, isn't it? I smiled and agreed, though I didn't have the heart to tell her that some families aren't worth having. That afternoon, I phoned my travel agent and extended my trip by another week. Then I called Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor who had been kindly checking in on my house. Everly, she answered cheerfully. How's Ireland treating? It's beautiful, Margaret. Everything Carlton promised it would be. I think I might stay a little longer. That's wonderful, she said warmly. Take all the time you need. The house is fine, and that nice Mr. Kowalski has been keeping an eye on the yard. After I hung up, I sat in the stillness of my little room and realized something I never expected. Something almost miraculous. I wasn't homesick. Not even a little. For the first time in my adult life, I was in a place Carlton and I had never shared together. And instead of feeling the hollow ache of his absence, I felt him beside me, more present than he'd been in years. It was as if he was finally free to travel with me, freed from the constant weight of providing for children who had never truly appreciated what he gave up for them. In the cliffs of Moher, I stood at the edge of the world itself. The Atlantic wind whipped my hair across my face, sharp and cold and alive. Before me stretched an endless expanse of ocean, a silver blue highway to America. its waves crashing and splintering against black rocks that had held their ground for thousands of years. I opened Carlton's worn leather journal, its pages soft from years of turning, and read one of my favorite entries. I hope someday Everly and I can see the world together. She's given me everything, her love, her loyalty, her faith in me, even when I didn't deserve it. I want to give her adventures, memories, something beautiful to look back on. I close my eyes, feeling the sting in my throat. You did give me something beautiful, I whispered into the wind, letting it carry my words far beyond the cliffs. You gave me 47 years of feeling completely, undeniably loved. On my last day in Ireland, I wandered into a small shop in Dublin, the kind that smelled faintly of peat and rain. I bought two things, a Celtic cross necklace for myself and a smooth stone engraved with an old Irish blessing meant for Carlton's grave back home. But I didn't stop there. From a rack near the counter, I picked out a set of postcards, photographs of wild Irish landscapes, green hills, and ancient ruins. That evening in my hotel room, I sat at the desk and wrote two identical messages. Ireland is beautiful. Carlton would have loved it here. I'm finally living the dreams we never got to share. I addressed one card to Mark in Seattle, the other to Sandra in Phoenix. Not because I hoped for answers, not because I was ready to forgive, but because Carlton would have wanted them to know I was okay, more than okay. He had spent years protecting them from the consequences of their choices. I had no intention of continuing that work. The flight home was bittersweet. I had fallen deeply in love with Ireland, with the quiet thrill of traveling alone, and with the version of myself I discovered when I wasn't waiting for phone calls that never came or for visits that never happened. Yet I was eager to return, to the house Carlton built with his own hands, to the garden where I had scattered earth from Patrick Patterson's grave, to the quiet, steady life I was learning to embrace. Mrs. Henderson met me at the airport, her eyes brimming with tears, holding a bouquet of flowers cut from my own garden. You look wonderful, Everly. Different, somehow. She was right. I did feel different. I felt like a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space, who no longer shrank herself to fit into the narrow margins allowed by people who didn't care if she existed at all. Back home, I planted the flowers I had brought from Ireland into Carlton's memory garden, a small corner of the backyard where I kept his presence alive. The Irish soil mingled with the California earth, a blending of past and future, of dreams once deferred and now lived. That evening, two messages waited on my answering machine. The first was from Mark, his voice stiff and awkward. Mom, got your postcard. Glad you're traveling. Call me when you get back. The second came from Sandra, slightly warmer, but no less hollow. Ireland looks beautiful, Mom. Hope you had a good time. We should talk soon. I deleted both without bothering to write down their numbers. 3 weeks later, while I was tending the tomatoes in my garden, a car pulled into the driveway. Sandra stepped out, looking overdressed for the August heat and nervous enough to be mistaken for a stranger. She had driven 4 hours to show up without warning. Hi, Mom, she began cautiously. I hope it's okay that I came by. I didn't stop what I was doing. That's your choice, Sandra. She lingered in the driveway, clearly hoping for a warmer welcome. When none came, she tried another tactic. The garden looks beautiful. Dad would be proud. Your father was proud of many things, I said evenly. Most of them you never bothered to notice. She flinched but pushed forward. I've been thinking about what you said at the funeral, about the money Dad sent us, about everything he did. I turned off the hose and faced her fully. I want to pay it back, she blurted. All of it. Derek and I figured out how much Dad must have given us over the years, and we want to make it right. I studied her face for sincerity, but found mostly guilt. And why would you want to do that, Sandra? Because it's the right thing to do. Because we should have been there for you, both of you. Because Dad deserved better from us. Yes, I said slowly. He did deserve better. But keeping his money won't give him what he truly deserved. He deserved your respect while he was alive. He deserved phone calls on his birthday, visits on holidays. He deserved to know his... Sandra's eyes shimmered with tears, as if each one carried the weight of years she could never take back. Her voice was trembling. but steady with determination. I know I can't change the past, she said softly, but maybe I can still honor his memory now. I looked at her, this grown woman who, in my mind's eye, was still the little girl who once perched on Carlton's broad shoulders, her small hands gripping his hair, laughing and calling him daddy, as if he were the most important man in her entire world. Back then, he had been her hero, her safe place. Somewhere along the twisting road of her life, she had forgotten that. She had forgotten him. And I knew deep down, no amount of money could help her remember. Keep the money, Sandra. I see him, I said at last, my voice firm but not unkind. Your father gave it to you freely, out of love. Sending it back now. That wouldn't erase the past. It would insult the love he felt for you. Her face crumpled, her composure folding in on itself. Then what can I do? How do I make this right? You can't, I said simply. There was no cruelty in my tone, only truth. Some things can't be fixed. They can only be learned from. I turned toward the house, my feet slow on the gravel, then paused and looked back at her. But if you truly want to honor your father's memory, stop trying to patch over your guilt. Instead, start living as the woman he believed you could becoming. Be a better mother to your children than you were a daughter to him. I left her there in the driveway, still rooted to the spot, as though my words had pinned her in place. When I closed the front door behind me, the quiet of the house pressed in on me, deep and familiar. That night, I sat on Carlton's side of the bed. The indentation of his absence was still there, as if the mattress remembered him. I reached for his journal, the one I'd kept tucked away since his passing, and turned to the last entry he had ever written. If something happens to me, I hope she'll understand that every choice I made was about love. I stared at the words, letting them sink into me. And suddenly, I understood. Carlton's love wasn't about shielding our children from the weight of their actions or encouraging their selfishness. It was about protecting me from the sting of their indifference, from the despair of realizing that the bond between parent and child can sometimes be a one-way street. He had wanted me to keep believing in them, even when that hope had become foolish. His greatest gift to me was not the money he'd secretly stored in the safety deposit box, nor even the truths he'd recorded in these pages. No, his true gift was showing me that love, real love, does not need to be returned to be worthwhile. It only needs a heart big enough to give it freely. I closed the journal gently and looked around the bedroom we had shared for 40 years, a space that had been both a witness to our everyday life and the quiet sanctuary where Carlton had written these thoughts while I slept beside him, unaware of the burdens he carried alone. Tomorrow I decided I would call the travel agent. Maybe I'd go to Scotland this time, or perhaps to Wales. Carlton had always wanted to see the rolling green hills and stone villages of the Welsh countryside where his mother's family had once lived. There were years of postponed dreams waiting for me and a lifetime of love to honor. Not the love I had poured, often in vain, into children who could not see my worth, but the love I had shared with a man who never once doubted it, even when I doubted myself. For the first time since Carlton's death, I drifted into sleep without the heaviness of grief pressing down on my chest. I knew now that his real legacy wasn't the material things he left behind. It was the quiet, unshakable lesson he'd given me, that courage means living fully, loving deeply, and daring to dream boldly, even when you have to do it alone.